Well, good afternoon, friends, and welcome to Thursdays Through the Bible. This is Pastor Keith for Trinity Chapel. Thanks for joining with me as we continue our study of God's Word. Today, the moment has finally arrived. We have finished our study of the Old Testament, and today we begin our cursory glance at the New Testament, beginning with the Gospels. And the first Gospel we're going to look at today is the Gospel according to Matthew. Gospels are unique forms of literature, and it really helps us to understand what we're actually reading when we read a gospel account. Gospel is a word that literally means good news, and that's really how you have to read these four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are not highly detailed biographies of the life of Jesus. They really are meant to communicate the good news of what he did. And that's why if you compared all four Gospels and how much attention they give to the last week of Jesus's earthly life, the Passion Week, his death, his burial, his resurrection from the dead, there is an inordinate amount of ink being spilled over that 1 week period of time. Matthew's gospel does it, Mark's gospel does it, Luke's gospel does it, and John's gospel does it too. They are eager to get you to what they rightly view as the climactic ultimate purpose of the coming of Jesus. Not just to be a good teacher and a good leader, but to be a sacrifice for sinners, to rise again from the dead, to conquer sin, death, and the grave for his people, and to establish the new age in him. And so God is fulfilling his promise that he had been giving for a long, long time, promises that we've seen in our study of the Old Testament. God is now bringing to fulfillment in the person of Jesus through his death, burial, and resurrection. And that's primarily what the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, want you to know. It's important to note from the outset that Gospels never claim to be biographies. They never claim to have all the details of the life of Jesus. In fact, the Apostle John very clearly tells us that he's not communicating every fact he knows about Jesus's life because he just doesn't have the space to do it. But he's telling us what he thinks is the most important. Important for us to know about the Gospels. As with the rest of the New Testament, I am one who believes very strongly that the entirety of the New Testament was finished before 70 AD, which is when the Jerusalem temple is destroyed by the Roman armies, and Jesus predicts that. But nowhere in the Gospels, nowhere in the New Testament letters does anyone say, hey, you know how Jesus said this would happen? Well, look at that. It happened, right? Jesus was correct, which leads us to believe that all these books are written before 70 AD. The Gospels are probably written in the mid-60s. Mark is likely the earliest, but Matthew is pretty early as well. And Matthew's Gospel, his account of the life and ministry of Jesus, is fascinating in a lot of ways. But the primary emphasis you might take away from Matthew's account of the gospel is how Jesus, as the son of David and the son of Abraham, fulfills the Old Testament. That is kind of Matthew's primary driving emphasis in his gospel. All the gospel writers have it. Mark, Luke, and John also have Jesus clearly fulfilling the Old Testament, but Matthew really is eager to show his readers how Jesus, as the true Israel, is going to fulfill everything that God had promised in the Old Testament. So Matthew uses the phrase even, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken, or to fulfill what was written. He says that a lot, that Jesus does things and lives a life in such a way that he fulfills God's Old Testament promises. There's also a possibility that Matthew even structures his gospel to reflect this kind of emphasis on Jesus being the true Israel. He organizes the teaching ministry of Jesus into 5 major sections that are distinguishable by a certain phrase that he uses. And these may be intended to reflect the 5 books of Moses that are traditionally by Jews and Christians attributed to Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. So Matthew may be sort of collecting all the teaching material of Jesus into 5 sections to emphasize how Jesus is the new prophet that Moses even said was coming, right? Moses said the Lord would raise up a greater prophet than him, and Jesus is that greater prophet, and Matthew wants us to know that. Matthew wants us to know how Jesus is the greater David. He's the greater Abraham. He's the greater Israel, right? Everything that he does is intended to not just live out what Israel had done, but to do it the right way, and to do it in such a way that by his perfect life and death, he can perfectly redeem God's people, which they'd been looking for hundreds, thousands of years at this point. Although Matthew has a very Jewish flavor and definitely has some very Jewish emphases, it is also a very Gentile-friendly gospel account. His is the gospel account that during the Christmas story, for example, he talks about the Magi, the Gentile magicians and wise men who travel from afar to come and worship Jesus, while the Jewish priests and scribes can't even be bothered to go and visit the Messiah. He's the one that has a very Gentile-friendly flavor. And by the end of the gospel account, he's the one that includes the clearest expression of Jesus's Great Commission, where Jesus says, go into all the world, go to all the nations, all the Gentiles, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And so, although Matthew does have a very Jewish flavor to it, his gospel is also clearly pointing his Jewish readers to the fact that God had been promising throughout the Old Testament that what he was doing in the Old Testament with Israel in the New Covenant was going to go and expand to every nation and fill the entire world with the praise of the one true God. So Matthew reflects that in his gospel account as well. It's a fascinating gospel to read. As I record this video at Trinity Chapel, we're currently going through Matthew in a sermon series. It's a really great book to preach through. But Matthew definitely wants us to come away with that very clear impression that Jesus is coming to do what Israel was really always meant to do. He's going to do it right, and he's going to do it to fulfill all the promises God had made under the Old Testament, and to inaugurate the new age that God had promised that is now come for you and me today, that we get to live and enjoy. So I hope you enjoy reading the Gospel of Matthew. It is a wonderful gospel account. Next week, we will look at the Gospel according to Mark. Until then, may God richly bless each one of you.